On a windswept moor in the Scottish Highlands, there stands a weathered gravestone that bears an inscription no living person has ever been able to explain. The name carved into the granite is Morvenna Blackthorn, but according to every record in the village of Kilmarnock, no one by that name has ever lived or died in the region. Yet for over 2 centuries, every child born into the Fenwick family has whispered that exact name as their first word, speaking it with perfect clarity before they can even say mama or papa. Tonight, we uncover the terrifying truth behind a bloodline cursed with knowledge they were never meant to possess. The story begins in 1847 with Hamish Fenwick, a sheep farmer whose modest cottage sat at the edge of the Kilmarnock moors. Hamish was known throughout the village as a practical man, skeptical of the supernatural tales that seemed to cling to every stone and stream in the Highlands. He attended the Presbyterian kirk with clockwork regularity, paid his debts on time, and treated his livestock with the kind of methodical care that marked him as a reliable neighbour. What he was not known for was his wife, because Hamish Fenwick had never married. This made it all the more shocking when, on the night of November 15, 1847, the village midwife was summoned to his cottage to deliver a baby. The child's mother, Hamish claimed, was his wife Margaret, who had been too ill to attend church or venture into the village during her pregnancy. But when the midwife arrived, she found no woman in the house, only Hamish holding a newborn infant and muttering about his wife having died in childbirth. The baby was healthy and strong, with the dark hair and pale skin characteristic of Highland stock, but there was something unsettling about the child from the very beginning. When the midwife lifted him to check his breathing, the infant's eyes fixed on hers with an intelligence that seemed far too ancient for someone mere hours old. And then, clear as a church bell, the baby spoke his first word, Morvenna. The midwife, a woman who had delivered hundreds of babies in her 4 decades of practice, later swore to the village minister that she had never heard anything like it. Newborns might cry, might gurgle, but they did not speak full names with the kind of deliberate pronunciation she had witnessed. When she asked Hamish about the name, he grew pale and insisted he had never heard it before, that the child must have been making meaningless sounds. But over the following days, as neighbours came to pay their respects and view the motherless infant, every visitor reported the same thing. The baby would look directly at them and repeat the same word, Morvenna. Not babbling, not random syllables, but a clear, purposeful pronunciation of a name that meant nothing to anyone in Kilmarnock. The minister, Reverend Douglas MacLeod, was so disturbed by the reports that he visited the Fenwick cottage to baptize the child personally. He found Hamish in a state of barely controlled panic, pacing the floor while the infant lay in a makeshift cradle, watching everything with those unnaturally alert eyes. When Reverend MacLeod approached to perform the baptism, the baby fixed his gaze on the minister's face and spoke the name again, this time with what sounded almost like recognition. Hamish named the boy Duncan, and as the child grew, the mystery only deepened. Duncan was precociously intelligent, walking before his first birthday, speaking in full sentences by 18 months. But no matter how much his vocabulary expanded, he continued to use the name Morvenna in ways that suggested it held deep significance for him. He would point to empty corners of the cottage and say, "Morvenna sits there." He would refuse to eat certain foods, claiming Morvenna doesn't like them. Most unnervingly, he would sometimes stop playing and stare into the distance, whispering the name like a prayer or an incantation. When Duncan was 3 years old, Hamish decided to investigate the name that had haunted his household since his son's birth. He travelled to Edinburgh, where he consulted church records, genealogical documents, and even the archives of the university library. After weeks of research, he found nothing. No Morvenna had ever been recorded in any Scottish birth, marriage, or death register. The name appeared in no census, no property deed, no legal document of any kind. It was as if the woman Duncan seemed to remember had never existed. But Hamish's search did uncover something else, something that filled him with a dread he could never fully articulate. In a collection of folk tales from the Highlands, he found references to a woman named Morvenna Blackthorn, who was said to have been executed for witchcraft in the village of Kilmarnock in 1623. According to the stories, Morvenna had been accused of trafficking with dark spirits, of placing curses on her neighbours' livestock, and most damning of all, of stealing newborn babies for use in satanic rituals. The records of her trial had been deliberately destroyed, burned along with her body, but the folk tales preserved fragments of testimony. Witnesses claimed that Morvenna had the power to speak through the mouths of children, that she could implant memories in the minds of infants, that even after death, her spirit would seek to possess the descendants of those who had condemned her. The stories also mentioned that Morvenna had sworn a terrible oath as she burned, promising that her name would never be forgotten, that it would be spoken by children yet unborn until the end of days. Hamish returned to Kilmarnock with this knowledge weighing on his conscience like a stone. He had never believed in witchcraft, had always dismissed such tales as primitive superstition, but Duncan's behaviour was impossible to explain through rational means. The boy continued to speak of Morvenna as though she were a living presence in his life, and as he grew older, his references became more detailed and more disturbing. At age 5, Duncan began drawing pictures that depicted a woman in old-fashioned clothing standing beside a burning pyre. He had no knowledge of historical dress, had never seen images of 17th-century Scottish attire, yet his drawings showed accurate details of the period. When asked who the woman was, he would always give the same answer: "That's Morvenna. She's waiting for something." By age 7, Duncan had begun speaking what sounded like archaic Scottish Gaelic, despite having never been taught the language. Linguistic experts who examined recordings of his speech confirmed that he was using grammatical structures and vocabulary that had been obsolete for centuries, as though he were channeling the voice of someone who had lived in a much earlier era. The most chilling development came when Duncan turned 10. He began to speak of other children, children who carried the same burden he did. "There are more of us," he told his father one evening as they sat by the fire. "In other places, other families. We all know her name. We all remember what she told us before we were born." Hamish initially dismissed this as childhood fantasy, but Duncan's claims proved disturbingly accurate. Through careful correspondence with relatives and acquaintances across Scotland, Hamish learned that there were indeed other families whose children had been born speaking the name Morvenna. A cousin in Inverness wrote of his grandson, who had startled the household by pronouncing the name clearly at just 2 days old. A friend in Glasgow reported that his neighbour's daughter had been speaking of Morvenna's garden since she could form words, despite having no knowledge of gardening or any person by that name. As Duncan entered adolescence, the manifestations intensified. He began having vivid dreams of a woman's execution, describing in horrific detail the smell of burning flesh, the sound of chanting crowds, the sight of a figure writhing in flames while pronouncing what sounded like curses in an ancient tongue. These dreams were so realistic that Duncan would wake screaming, his clothes soaked with sweat, his hands unconsciously making gestures that looked remarkably like those used in protective rituals by medieval clergy. But the dreams also brought knowledge. Duncan began to understand that he was part of a larger pattern, that the name Morvenna Blackthorn was not randomly occurring in children across Scotland, but was being systematically implanted in specific bloodlines. Through his nocturnal visions, he learned that all the affected families shared a common ancestor, a man named Tobias Fenwick, who had been one of the primary witnesses against Morvenna during her trial for witchcraft in 1623. The historical records Hamish had found were incomplete, but Duncan's dreams filled in the missing details with terrifying precision. Tobias Fenwick had been a prosperous merchant in 17th-century Kilmarnock, a man whose testimony had been crucial in securing Morvenna's conviction. He had accused her of cursing his pregnant wife, causing their first child to be stillborn. In revenge, he had helped fabricate evidence against Morvenna, bribing other witnesses to support false claims of witchcraft. As Morvenna burned at the stake, she had looked directly at Tobias and spoken a curse that would echo through the centuries. Your bloodline will remember my name when your own is forgotten. Every child born of your line will carry my voice in their throat until my justice is satisfied. They will know what you have done, and they will pay the price for your lies." Duncan's dreams revealed that Morvenna's curse had been working exactly as intended. Every generation of Tobias Fenwick's descendants had produced children who were born with implanted memories of the witch's trial and execution. These children grew up knowing, on a level deeper than conscious thought, that their ancestor had committed a terrible injustice and that they were connected to a woman who had died in agony while calling for vengeance. But the curse was more than just genetic memory. Duncan began to understand that Morvenna's spirit was using the affected children as anchors, tethering herself to the world of the living through their shared knowledge of her name. Each child who spoke the name strengthened her connection to the mortal realm, and as more generations were born, her power grew correspondingly stronger. This realization came with a price. As Duncan's awareness of the curse intensified, he began to experience what he described as visitations. He would wake in the middle of the night to find a shadowy female figure standing at the foot of his bed, her form wavering like heat shimmers, her mouth moving in soundless speech. During these encounters, he felt compelled to repeat her name over and over, as though his voice were the only thing keeping her anchored in existence. The visitations were accompanied by physical phenomena that terrified both Duncan and his father. Temperatures in the cottage would drop so suddenly that their breath became visible. Objects would move on their own, books flying from shelves, dishes shattering without being touched. Most unnervingly, Duncan's own voice would sometimes change during these episodes, becoming higher and more feminine, speaking words in archaic Gaelic that he consciously did not understand. By the time Duncan reached his 18th birthday, the supernatural manifestations had become so severe that neighbors began to avoid the Fenwick cottage entirely. The local minister, Reverend MacLeod, attempted several times to perform exorcisms, but his efforts only seemed to anger whatever presence was haunting the family. After one particularly intense session, Duncan was found unconscious on the floor, with the word Morvenna carved into his arm as though by invisible claws. It was during this period of crisis that Duncan received an unexpected visitor. A young woman named Elizabeth Sinclair arrived in Kilmarnock, claiming to be a distant relative, tracing her ancestry back to the same Tobias Fenwick who had figured so prominently in Duncan's dreams. Elizabeth brought with her a collection of family documents and a story that perfectly complemented Duncan's supernatural experiences. Elizabeth's family, she explained, had been dealing with the same curse for generations. Her own first word had been Morvenna, and she had grown up experiencing the same dreams, the same visitations, the same overwhelming sense of guilt for an ancestor's crime. But her family had not remained passive in the face of the supernatural torment. They had been researching the curse for decades, trying to understand its mechanics and find a way to break it. According to Elizabeth, there were at least 7 family lines descended from Tobias Fenwick, scattered across Scotland, Ireland, and northern England. All had produced children who spoke Morvenna's name as their first word, and all were experiencing escalating supernatural phenomena as the 200th anniversary of the witch's execution approached. Elizabeth believed that the curse was building toward some kind of culmination, that Morvenna's spirit was gathering strength from all the affected bloodlines in preparation for a final manifestation of revenge. The documentation Elizabeth brought with her supported this theory. She had collected testimonies from affected families dating back to the early 1700s, showing a clear pattern of children born with knowledge of Morvenna's name and story. But more importantly, she had discovered references to a ritual that might be able to break the curse, though the cost would be enormous. According to a manuscript her family had preserved, written by a 17th-century Catholic priest who had witnessed Morvenna's execution, the curse could only be broken if all the surviving members of the affected bloodlines gathered at the site of her death and formally acknowledged Tobias Fenwick's crimes. They would need to publicly confess his sins, ask forgiveness for his false testimony, and make restitution to Morvenna's spirit. But the ritual came with a terrible condition. One member of each bloodline would need to remain at the execution site permanently, serving as a living guardian to ensure that Morvenna's grave was never disturbed. These guardians would lose their connection to their families and their former lives, becoming essentially human sacrifices to appease a spirit that had waited over 2 centuries for justice. Duncan and Elizabeth spent months corresponding with other affected families, trying to convince them to participate in the ritual. The responses they received painted a picture of widespread desperation. A family in Edinburgh reported that their youngest child had begun speaking exclusively in Morvenna's voice, using archaic language to describe torture methods used during witch trials. A household in Belfast described nightly poltergeist activity so intense that they had been forced to abandon their home. Most disturbing of all was a letter from a family in Yorkshire whose children had begun exhibiting stigmata, developing spontaneous burns on their hands and arms that formed patterns resembling the restraints used to bind condemned witches to burning stakes. The affected children claimed that Morvenna was showing them exactly what she had experienced during her execution, forcing them to feel her pain as though it were their own. As reports of escalating phenomena reached Duncan and Elizabeth, they realized the time was running short. The 200th anniversary of Morvenna's execution was approaching, and the supernatural manifestations were becoming not just frightening, but dangerous. 2 children from affected families had already died, one from injuries sustained during a violent poltergeist episode, another from what appeared to be spontaneous combustion during a particularly intense visitation. With growing desperation, Duncan and Elizabeth managed to convince representatives from 6 of the 7 bloodlines to meet in Kilmarnock in November of 1823, exactly 2 centuries after Morvenna's death. The 7th family, from Northern Ireland, had gone silent months earlier, and Duncan feared that the supernatural phenomena had claimed them entirely. The gathering that took place on November 15, 1823, was unlike anything the village of Kilmarnock had ever witnessed. 18 people, ranging in age from 5 to 70, assembled at midnight on the moor where Morvenna Blackthorne had been executed. All of them carried the same burden of inherited guilt. All had spoken her name as their first word. All bore the psychological scars of dreams filled with fire and accusation. The ritual they performed was part seance, part confession, and part funeral service. Led by Elizabeth, who had spent years studying the religious practices of 17th century Scotland, the gathered families formally acknowledged Tobias Fenwick's crimes against Morvenna. They recited his false testimony word for word, admitted that he had perjured himself for money, and begged Morvenna's spirit for forgiveness. As the ceremony proceeded, the supernatural phenomena intensified beyond anything any of them had previously experienced. The temperature dropped so severely that frost formed on the ground, despite the November warmth. Lights appeared in the sky, dancing and writhing like flames, while voices speaking in archaic Gaelic seemed to emanate from the earth itself. But the most shocking manifestation was the appearance of Morvenna herself. As the families reached the climax of their confession, a figure materialized in the center of their circle, translucent but unmistakably real. She was exactly as she had appeared in Duncan's dreams, a woman of perhaps 30 years, dressed in the simple clothing of a 17th century peasant, her hair long and dark, her face bearing the terrible burns she had received during her execution. Morvenna's ghost did not speak, but her presence communicated volumes. The assembled families felt her pain, her rage, her desperate hunger for acknowledgement of the injustice done to her. But they also felt her weariness, her longing for an end to the curse that had bound her spirit to the world for 2 centuries. The ritual required that one member from each bloodline volunteer to remain as a guardian, and 6 people stepped forward, including Duncan himself. They understood that they were sacrificing their normal lives, committing themselves to a form of spiritual imprisonment, but they also knew that it was the only way to free their families from the curse that had plagued them for generations. As the Guardians took their positions around what had once been Morvenna's execution site, the witch's spirit began to fade. Her final gesture was a nod of acknowledgement, a sign that the debt had been paid and the curse lifted. With her disappearance, the supernatural phenomena ceased entirely, leaving the moor in a silence more profound than any of the gathered families had experienced in their lifetimes. The immediate effects of the ritual were dramatic. Children who had been speaking in Morvenna's voice returned to normal speech. The poltergeist activity that had plagued affected households stopped entirely. Most importantly, babies born to the bloodlines after November 1823 spoke normal first words, mama and papa and similar childish utterances, instead of the name that had haunted their families for 2 centuries. But the cost was exactly what had been promised. The 6 guardians who remained at the execution site found themselves unable to leave the immediate area. They established a small community on the moor, supporting themselves through crafts and small-scale agriculture, but always remaining within sight of the place where Morvenna had died. They aged normally, married among themselves and raised children, but none of them ever traveled more than a mile from the Guardian's site. Duncan lived until 1871, spending 48 years as a Guardian. His journals, preserved by the Guardian community, describe a life of strange contentment despite the restrictions. He wrote of feeling Morvenna's presence as a protective rather than threatening force, and of understanding that his sacrifice had freed not only his own bloodline, but the spirit of a woman who had been wrongly condemned to death. The Guardian tradition continued for 3 more generations, with children born to the original Guardians choosing to remain and serve in their parents' place. But by 1900, something began to change. The descendants of the Guardians reported that they no longer felt Morvenna's presence, and the supernatural compulsions that had kept their ancestors bound to the site began to weaken. In 1923, exactly 100 years after the ritual, the last Guardian died without choosing a successor. His children and grandchildren felt no obligation to remain at the execution site, and gradually the small community dispersed, returning to normal life in the surrounding villages. Modern investigators who have studied the Fenwick family records find a story that challenges conventional understanding of heredity, memory, and the persistence of trauma across generations. While the supernatural elements may be dismissed as folklore or psychological phenomena, the documented pattern of children speaking the same specific name as their first word across multiple generations and geographical locations remains unexplained by current science. Genetic researchers have proposed theories about inherited memory, suggesting that traumatic experiences might leave epigenetic markers that can be passed to subsequent generations. Psychologists have explored the possibility of collective unconscious phenomena, arguing that shared family narratives might create psychological conditions that manifest as seemingly supernatural experiences. But for the descendants of the Fenwick bloodlines, academic explanations matter less than the lived reality of their family history. They know that something profound occurred in their ancestral past, something traumatic enough to echo through centuries of births and deaths. Whether that something was a literal curse or a psychological wound, the pattern it created was broken only through acknowledgement, confession, and sacrifice. The gravestone that marks Morvenna Blackthorn's final resting place still stands on the moor outside Kilmarnock, its inscription still clearly visible despite 2 centuries of Highland weather. But the name, carved into the granite, is no longer spoken by newborn children. The curse has been lifted, the debt paid, the spirit finally at rest. Local historians note that the site has become a place of pilgrimage for people researching their own family mysteries, drawn by the story of a bloodline that carried ancestral guilt for generations until they found the courage to face their past and make amends for their ancestors' crimes. The lesson of the Fenwick family resonates beyond the supernatural elements of their tale, reminding us that the sins of the past can cast long shadows, and that sometimes the only way to break free is through acknowledgement, truth-telling, and the willingness to pay whatever price justice demands. In the end, the bizarre story of the Fenwick family reveals a truth that transcends the boundaries between natural and supernatural, that secrets have power, that guilt can be inherited, and that some debts can only be paid by the courage to speak names that others would prefer to forget. Morwenna Blackthorn's name is finally silent, but her story serves as a reminder that justice, however long delayed, will eventually find its voice.